When indeed men speak of beauty, they mean precisely not a quality as is supposed, but an effect. That's actually a quote from the legendary Edgar Allan Poe, talking about how he wrote his famous poem, The Raven. And it's a pretty incredible hook, right? I mean, we usually think of beauty as this abstract, untouchable quality just floating around in the ether. But Poe? He argued the exact opposite. He claimed beauty is a visceral, emotional effect. It's a meticulous manipulation designed to create a pure elevation of the soul. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to demystify beauty. We are literally popping the hood on language to break down exactly how writers mechanically engineer that intense emotional elevation. So if you've ever wondered why a certain poem suddenly gives you chills, or why a specific speech just makes you want to leap out of your chair, well, you are definitely in the right place. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the anatomy of beauty, the philosophy of the aesthetic, the science of stylistics, literature as a laboratory, and finally, the universal cultural taste. Let's jump in. All right, part 1, philosophy of the aesthetic, where we define the abstract. Okay, before we can get into the actual linguistic nuts and bolts, we really need to ground ourselves in the big picture. When you look at the definition of aesthetics, which is the philosophical study of beauty, taste, and art, it forces us to ask a pretty monumental question. Is beauty an objective truth that exists out there in the real world, or is it an entirely subjective experience that's just happening inside our own minds? And that question kicks off a debate that's literally been raging for millennia. On one side, you have the classical idea of objective beauty. This is the idea that beauty is a harmonious, almost mathematical arrangement of parts that actually lives inside the object itself. But on the flip side, you have subjective beauty, sometimes called aesthetic hedonism. This argues that beauty is purely in the eye and the pleasurable emotional response of the beholder. Which naturally leads us to another massive philosophical divide: intentionalism. Does a writer's original intention actually matter? I mean, intentionalism argues that the author's intent is the ultimate key to unlocking meaning. But critics will point to the intentional fallacy. They argue that a writer's true intent is totally unknowable, so aesthetic meaning can really only come from the text itself and how we, the readers, interpret it. Moving right along to part 2, the science of stylistics. Let's do a linguistic zoom in. Now, this is where things get super practical, and honestly, a lot of fun. Stylistics is a branch of applied linguistics. It basically builds a bridge between literary criticism and hard linguistics. It gives us the exact, measurable tools to analyze the specific choices a writer makes. So we're shifting our study of aesthetics away from lofty philosophy and moving it right into verifiable data. A foundational concept here comes straight from the Prague school back in the early 20th century. They had this incredible idea that writers make art by taking standard, everyday, background language and intentionally pulling it forward. They called it foregrounding, and it happens through deliberate, stylistic deviations from the norm. Think of it as the contrast between how you might casually order a coffee versus how a poet describes the morning sun. So, how exactly do writers foreground their language? Well, they tinker with the grammar. They use implicature to plant these strong or weak implied meanings right under the surface. They play around with register, completely altering their tone and vocabulary depending on who they're talking to or the vibe of the setting. They'll even manipulate tense, suddenly jumping between past and present to create these jarring, dramatic shifts. By pulling these levers, writers create what linguist Adrian Pilkington calls poetic effects. They're actively guiding you toward a very specific emotional destination. Which brings us to part 3, literature as a laboratory. Let's experiment with some words. The coolest thing here is that we can literally view literature as a living, breathing laboratory, where these stylistic tools are tested out to create aesthetic language. Take this famous excerpt from William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. It feels incredibly peaceful, doesn't it? But why? That aesthetic effect of peacefulness, it isn't magic. It's totally mechanically engineered. Wordsworth uses a crystal clear simile comparing himself to a drifting cloud. He uses this really strict, rhythmic, A-B-A-B-C-C rhyming scheme that just kind of lulls the ear. And he selects a very deliberate lexicon of natural words, vales, hills, daffodils, to intentionally relieve the narrator's burden of solitude. It is a completely calculated aesthetic of calm. Now, let's totally flip the script. Contrast that calm peacefulness with this hyper-persuasive, foregrounded speech by Mark Antony in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. I'm sure you recognize it. But look closely at what Shakespeare's actually doing with the language beneath the surface. Shakespeare is basically running a masterclass in mechanics here. He uses a rhythmic progression of ideas to build to a massive climax. He uses deep, biting irony, repeatedly calling the mutineers honorable just to slowly turn the crowd against them. And he uses alliteration, repeating those N sounds, and assonance, repeating E sounds, to create this undeniable rhythmic beauty. It's brilliant. He subtly sways an entire Roman crowd without them ever realizing they are being manipulated by the phonetics. All right, let's pivot and look at an excerpt from Chinua Achebe's masterpiece, Things Fall Apart. "Looking at a king's mouth," said an old man, "one would think he never sucked at his mother's breast." This is such a brilliant example of grounding aesthetic choices in an African cultural setting. What Achebe does here is absolutely masterful. He bypasses Western idioms entirely and foregrounding the text using local Igbo proverbs. He uses a parallel structure to present a striking psychological mirror to his protagonist's sudden arrogance. The aesthetic beauty here is derived entirely from lexical choices that highlight local cultural color. It's proof that these stylistic mechanics can be seamlessly adopted to fit literally any cultural context. All right, part 4, the universal cultural taste. Let's talk about cross-cultural aesthetics. So, the actual stylistic gears and levers of language are pretty universal. But the aesthetic goals they aim for, those can vary wildly across different cultures. How we process the outputs of these literary laboratories depends entirely on our socially cultivated taste. Taste is our sensitivity to aesthetic qualities. And that sensitivity varies immensely, not just from person to person, but from culture to culture. Just look at how different traditions define the ultimate goal of beauty. It's fascinating. In India, aesthetics often focus on rasas, which are all about sparking universal human emotions. Chinese aesthetics heavily value the 3 perfections of poetry, painting, and calligraphy working together in spontaneous harmony. African aesthetics frequently emphasize intuition and the communal or moral function of the art. Meanwhile, Western aesthetics often lean into disinterested pleasure and high art just for art's sake. Completely different tastes, completely different aesthetic goals. And trying to figure out exactly why we have these specific tastes is a massive, rapidly evolving field of study right now. Some people, conventionalists, argue art is purely a social construct, but the scientists are weighing in too. Evolutionary psychologists are suggesting that our aesthetic preferences might actually be adaptive survival traits, meaning we like what kept our ancestors alive. We even have researchers in neuroaesthetics putting people in MRI machines to observe their orbital frontal cortex. It is absolutely mind-blowing that we can physically map the biological roots of why a certain stylistic deviation makes us feel good. So what is the big takeaway from this explainer? It's that those chills you get from a killer poem or the tears you cry over a great novel, the inspiration from a massive speech, they aren't random accidents. They are meticulously engineered stylistic effects. Writers are basically linguistic scientists manipulating syntax, rhythm, and register to literally reach into your mind and elevate your soul. To wrap things up, I'm going to leave you with this to chew on. Now that you actually know the mechanics behind the curtain, how are you going to consciously manipulate your own everyday language tomorrow? How will you foreground your words to engineer your own aesthetic effect? Thanks so much for learning with me.